welcome to this video. Today I want to talk about trauma. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I came into the world of working with trauma. I want to talk a little bit about somatic experiencing. I want to talk about polyvagal theory, and I want to talk about going beyond polyvagal theory, going beyond somatic experiencing, and separating out shock trauma, developmental trauma, and just naming some of the differences involved in these things. So I first came into this kind of work, I mean, when I was younger, I did a course in something called Seikim, which was energy healing, which I found really interesting. Didn't really understand it, and perhaps at some level still don't today, but it's not dissimilar to Reiki. And from there I took an interest in massage. I took a massage, and that massage was very moving. I wasn't expecting it at all. Hadn't really had massages before, and I was expecting to just go, receive some massage, and probably come out a bit more relaxed. That was what I imagined. And as it happened, that massage was profoundly moving. I was moved by the way I was touched with so much care, and the gentleness and the slowness, and I felt like I'd really been nurtured and looked after. And it really, I cried a lot. Just with that feeling of being so well cared for, and in a physical sense. So immediately I felt I want to know what this is. I want to be able to do this. I want to be able to work with this. And so I found the school where that massage therapist had studied, and I went and I studied in that school, and it was a beautiful process. The school is called Oasis, Californian Massage School in Buenos Aires, Argentina. It's still here today, so if you want to go and check it out, I very much recommend it. And they are teaching Californian Massage. Esalen Massage is essentially the same thing. And what I found was that this slow style of coming into the body, this caring nature, this meditative aspect, really created the conditions to allow us to come into the body, to feel the body, in a way that I didn't really know was possible before. I don't think I'd ever really had a relationship with my body like that before this. So, and the one thing that I was really blown away by, I was never hugely excited by massage itself, but there was something about the emotional release that I found absolutely profound. So seeing my teachers work, and seeing people on the table just crying and releasing, and in such a way that there was really a lightness of spirit that could be felt throughout the room between everyone, I would say. So a real sense of something important and profound has been released here. And my teachers were Ingrid May and Nadia McNamara, and really I learned this idea that the tissue itself cries. It's like the tissue, the muscles themselves hold the stories that they've been going through. So the idea that somehow the impact of situations that we've been through have remained imprinted as implicit memory in the body, and that by finding that tension with the right amount of pressure and the right amount of care leads to the possibility that we can release that tension and that emotion simultaneously. and really working on, or really opening up this idea that for every tension being held in the body, that there is a corresponding emotion that goes with it. So I found this just fascinating. Studied with the Traeger Institute as well, that very much had that same focus, the idea that there's, when the words of Milton Traeger, who was a boxer turned medical doctor turned body worker, he says that for every tension in the body, there is an equal tension being held in the unconscious mind. That was his idea. And this was exactly what seemed true to me as I was watching other people work, and I was receiving these sessions, and I was working on sessions, and I was amazed to see people just having these big emotional processes, sometimes quite cathartic, sometimes very releasing. It was a really profound experience and a profound few years of healing for me to go through. So that whole work was based very much on Gestalt psychotherapy principles, along the idea of taking the person as a whole, breaking down the idea of the Cartesian split, the idea that the mind and the body are separate, and really just knowing that we are fully integrated. We have, obviously, we have a body, and we have mental faculties, and we have dreams and desires, and we live life through a narrative, and our health is created by a wide combination of factors, from the family unit we grow up in, and the education we go through, and the nutrition of the food that we eat, and the exercise we get, and the traumatic events that we go through, and that we are an integrated library of all of those experiences, and somehow that whole integrated library is accessible through the body and through touch. So I very much fell in love with the body, and came to this quite profound conclusion for me, which was that the body doesn't lie. The body doesn't lie. We can tell ourselves all sorts of stories about things, but the body doesn't lie. At the end of the day, the body is either in a pattern of holding tension, or it's in a pattern of being open and available, or it's in a pattern of collapse, where it's dysfunctional, where it's lost its tonality. And so really by touching, have a profound sense of really touching that person, really seeing who that person is. When I touch a body, or even with my own body, get a real sense of who I am at this time, who I'm being, in a very profound way. And that really moved me. Having come from studying philosophy beforehand, I went into studying philosophy with a real desire to find something like wisdom and depth. And what I found was more of a study of logic and of mostly Anglo philosophy. And that philosophy was very, let's just say, heady, is a good way of putting it. And it didn't seem to me like I was really finding that kind of deep integrative wisdom that would be transformative, some kind of practice that goes along with it, in the way that you might get with Tai Chi or with yoga or even martial arts. And so for me, with massage, I really found something that was embodied. Suddenly it was all about being in the body. At the same time, I was training to be a yoga teacher, so there was a really nice combination of the actual hard work on the one side of moving the body, of really training the body, and on the other side, this releasing of old tensions and getting in contact with new ways of relaxing and new ways of relating to people. So I went through that training and carried on with the training, and as an assistant and eventually as a teacher. And and I created essentially a model of what healing was like, what happens in healing. And for a long time, and for many people, that model seemed to be functional. And the model was something like, there are times when we don't manage to process everything, and what we don't manage to process gets stuck in the body. So let's say it's repressed from conscious awareness perhaps, and then by getting, for example via massage, but by getting in contact with that tension being held, there is the possibility of releasing that tension and the emotions associated with that. That was pretty simply the model that I was using. But there were certain clients with whom that model seemed to not be working. So there would be a release in one session which looked and felt like, oh, this is a real release of some kind of emotion. But it didn't have that lightness that I mentioned earlier. There's a certain lightness of spirit that happens when there's a real heartfelt release of a primary emotion, I would call it today. And often with certain clients, I would notice that there's an emotion that's being released that doesn't have that kind of depth to it. It has more of a heavy, sticky, uncomfortable kind of feeling to it. And these clients would come back and go through the similar kind of process every week, and so I felt like we weren't really getting anywhere. And this led me to feel the need to deepen my knowledge. Something in my map was not complete, and so I started exploring, and somebody recommended Somatic Experiencing, recommended trauma work, and so I found a training coming up and went through that 3-year training with the Somatic Experiencing Institute, also here in Buenos Aires, but associated with the Somatic Experiencing Institute there in the States. And this really gave me an extra branch to the model of healing, and an understanding that there is more than just the possibility of the tension being held in the body or the tension being released from the body. What I started to understand is that I started to understand that an emotion can be too much to feel. So when it's too much, that emotion in one language gets repressed, in another emotion in another language that emotion gets frozen. So the emotion itself gets left in the body and we dissociate from it, so we can't feel it. And this is a way of staying safe, effectively. Until a time when we do have the time, the space, the resiliency to be able to process that emotion, the safety necessary to process that emotion, to be able to release it. What I came to understand is the freeze response, effectively. And I'm going to touch on polyvagal theory now. When I discovered polyvagal theory inside Somatic Experiencing, it was like discovering a magic key. It was like, this is what I have been looking for the past 3 or 4 years that took me on this journey of looking, asking people, reading books, trying to find what was it that was going on that I wasn't finding. And what the understanding that I came to is that there are emotions that are too intense for us to feel. There are experiences that happen too quickly for us to process. And the way we deal with that is we shut down all of the sensory apparatus related to that. And so effectively we dissociate from that story, and the felt senses are frozen, so we lose track of them. And so it's a great way of surviving. We can not have to feel all of those things, and there's a dissociating from the body, and we end up being a lot more mental in that process. But it's a way of being able to continue along a path without that experience being so overwhelming that it kills me. So we just shut it down. Now, that which has been shut down, if we just go in and try and open that up in one go, it's very possible that all we do is re-engage that shutdown system, because we open it up and again it's just overwhelming. So somatic experiencing, what they do, what Peter Levine does here, is he uses something called pendulation. So what he does is he swings into that discomfort and then he swings out of it. So he sets up a situation which could be a positive resource, for example. So a positive resource could be it's go to your happy place is a great example, or just a positive memory, something good, so that when you think about it, there's a sense of the body relaxing, finding safety. We can also find just a part of the body that feels comfortable. So we swing from that resource or from that comfortable part of the body into this traumatic memory that has frozen. We feel a little bit and then we swing out to rest. Swing into feel, swing out to rest. Swing into feel, swing out to rest. So what we're doing here is we're working in a more titrated way. So titration is something that's used in chemistry when we want to bring two chemicals together, which if they were brought together in one go would be explosive. You can add them together drop by drop so that there's a very slow process to avoid that big explosion. And so this is the same theory that's being used here. We swing in to this traumatic content and then we swing out again to rest, so that we can really start to go in and process it. So what had been happening to me and these clients that I mentioned earlier is that we've been going in to this content, and rather than being able to just feel it and process it, it had become overwhelming, and they dropped into a place of collapse where they were perhaps crying, but not because they're releasing, but crying through the desperation of being stuck or frozen. And through this new lens, I now look at that as something that's reinforcing the same pattern of trauma, the same response. So I'm going to stop for a second and just caveat this, which is, well, what is trauma? It seems right now that everywhere you look, trauma is the thing. There's a million books about trauma. If you go on Twitter or TikTok or Instagram, everybody's talking about trauma. So what is trauma, right? Peter Levine defines it not as an event in itself, but how the nervous system responds to that event. So you might have 2 or 3 people in a situation, everyone goes to the same situation, but only one person really has trauma at the end of it. And so for there to be trauma, what it means is that the nervous system has found the situation overwhelming. The nervous system has had to freeze to survive through that, which is also a protective function, of course. But so the nervous system has frozen in an attempt to stay safe, and often in that freezing, it has frozen the sympathetic energy that was there, that was prepared to get us away, but ended up freezing. And so at the same time, we have these two opposite types of effects. We have the freeze responses. And so the freeze responses have to do with feeling stuck, feeling cold, feeling small. Part of the freeze response is the movement towards closing up into a ball in an attempt to avoid destruction, right? It's also the freeze because I don't know what I'm supposed to do yet. So I freeze before I can work out, should I run, should I fight, how do I survive this? And so there's a freeze while we're working out what we're going to do. And the freezing is this, it's an old concept. It's the idea of the Medusa that turns us to stone. We get stuck, we get paralyzed, right? So within that freezing, often just before freezing, we were prepared to run, we were prepared to move. And so our body's actually in a tonic state. Perhaps our hands and our arms feel prepared to fight, and our legs feel prepared to run. Perhaps our nervous system has really got our heart pounding. And so with trauma, we can often get both of these types of effects. So we can get high anxiety. So we might be feeling hot, we might have pupils dilated, we might be sweating with heat, accelerated heart rate, high feelings of anxiety, of hyperarousal, and at the same time feeling stuck, feeling lethargic, feeling hopeless. And so simultaneously this feeling of depression and anxiety coexisting. This is very, very typical with trauma. Or the movement, the fast movement between these two places, right? So trauma is not just had a negative experience. That's not trauma. We all have negative experiences and we work through them and we get through them. But trauma is when you get these kinds of responses in the nervous system. And often a thing to pay attention to is when something happens that the response to that is exaggerated. So perhaps there's a glass of water falls on the floor and the person's response seems way more exaggerated than the real gravity of a glass of water falling on the floor. When you get these exaggerated responses, this is a sign that there's trauma going on there, because we've got the hyperarousal going on. This is one of the signs. So if you notice these movements between hyper alert or down to hypo alert, where there's no alert at all, bouncing between these two when there's exaggerated responses, these are the kinds of responses that tell us that there's some kind of trauma. Trauma is not, oh, I didn't like what he said, that felt bad. It's not being offended. Like these things are not trauma, and trauma is, there's a lot of concept creep going on with trauma at the moment. A lot of people are calling a lot of things trauma that is not really trauma. And it's good for us to start to clean that up, I think, and start to really let just trauma be what it is and nothing more. So the aim of somatic experiencing is to really help to regulate the nervous system, which means to get back to a state of, we can enter into arousal when we need it, when we need to be active, and we can enter states of rest when we need to rest. That's what we're looking to create in somatic experiencing. And so for anybody that's dealing with situations of stress, of excess anxiety, feelings of collapse, feelings of depression, all of these can fit into the work within somatic experiencing. Now within that, I'd like to set up an important separation between types of trauma. So the classic trauma that you hear about is shock trauma. So when we think of shock trauma, we think of events that happen to grown adults out of the blue, perhaps. So this could mean a car crash. Famously, we think of PTSD and we think of war zones, we think of bombs going off, we think of rape victims. It's these kinds of events that have happened out of the blue, where we haven't been able to defend ourselves for one reason or another, and our nervous system has not been able to recover and it is still in a state of freeze, and within that freeze there's fight-flight responses going on still. And so shock trauma is one category of trauma, if you will. So within this style of work, and this is really the style of work that somatic experiencing was developed for by Peter Levine originally. So looking at how do we recover our ability to function after a shock like this. So there are subcategories of trauma within shock trauma. So within that, for example, we might have things like inescapable attack. So car crashes is another option, or falls is an option, burns, surgeries. These are all situations that tend to happen at high speed. There tends to not be a sense of control of something we can resolve. And so within this type of work, what we often need to do is make sure we can create some safety to start with, so that we can use this pendulation technique to go from safety into the charge that's being held there from the traumatic experience, so that we have a kind of safety net, so we can swing from the safety net into the traumatic content and out again. Within that, we'll often need to help build up the sense of boundaries of the person, and often a big part of that is completing the defensive responses that have not been completed. So for example, let's imagine a car crash. Imagining a car crash, obviously it happens at speed and we try to protect ourselves. We'll naturally bring our hands up to try and protect ourselves. So we may well find a few years later, after a car crash like this, that we have spontaneous movements, perhaps some kind of tic that moves up like this, or tension being held up in this area, and that there is a protective response that's still trying to cover somehow. And so as part of that, we might help them reenact that feeling of covering and protecting to help complete that defensive response. Similarly, if somebody has been attacked, we might want to help them complete the feeling of pushing away and being able to defend themselves successfully before running. And I've named the final one, running. So what we're doing here is we're looking, how do we complete the fight responses? So when there are tension, when there is buzzing, electricity, energy, anxiety held in the upper part of the body, it often can be a sign that there are fight responses held in the body, right? Or if we're looking at that kind of nervous feeling in the feet, I'm sure you've seen the people whose feet don't stop tapping. That was very much me before going through that training. There's a flight response that hasn't been completed, and so we need to touch into that traumatic charge and then actually let that person move their feet, run, have that feeling of escaping. So look to complete these kinds of defensive responses first. Complete fight, complete flight, so that the person can come out of the freeze that had to be used because the fight-flight responses weren't online. And notice that we're starting to build a hierarchy here. The final response available to us is the freeze response. Above that freeze response is the fight and the flight responses. So just to name this freeze response a bit more, the freeze response is the oldest response we have. It's the oldest response that we have as humans, and it's shared with other mammals, and it's shared with reptiles, and it's shared with fish. So if you'll notice that reptiles in particular are capable of staying incredibly still for a very long time, and it's that branch of the nervous system, it's part of the vagus nerve, it's the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve that allows that total stillness. So this is our freeze response. I often think about Jurassic Park when a Tyrannosaurus Rex comes in and they stop still in the hope that it won't awaken the predatory instincts of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. They're freezing in an attempt to convince the Tyrannosaurus Rex that they're not alive, that they're not worthy of being caught. So the freeze response, our oldest response, phylogenetically speaking, so in terms of our evolution, that's the response that's been in our nervous systems the longest. Then we have the fight-flight systems, which are part of the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is all about movement. So that's both play, it's rough and tumble, it's sports, it's action, it's climbing, it's all these things. And of course, in a defensive sense, it's fighting or it's running away, fight-flight. And this was the branch that came on after the second, the next evolution, as it were. And then just to complete this hierarchy, the final, at the top of this hierarchy now, is social engagement, is the top of the hierarchy. This is how we look to resolve problems now. So we don't have to freeze, we don't have to run away, we don't have to fight, we can resolve it by talking. And so this, which is again part of the vagus nerve, and it's part of the ventral branch of the vagus nerve. Its main function, it serves as a brake to start with on the other older systems. So it puts on like a handbrake to both the freeze responses and to the fight-flight responses. And it looks to resolve problems from speaking, talking, shouting if necessary. But it looks to resolve the problems without having to drop down to older and less efficient ways of responding to situations. And so when we're working with trauma, we're working with the inverse order of that. So generally speaking, people will be coming in frozen, and we'll be looking how to help them come out of the freeze by feeling safe, how to complete the fight-flight responses, and how to get back up into social engagement. That's our general pathway. Now, that can be very different in terms of how somebody can move through that, because it's tied very intimately into many different beliefs, mandates, the narrative that the person lives their life through will hugely change what they believe they can do, how they believe they can function. And this is often one of the issues. It's the mandates, things like I'm not allowed to punch, things like I shouldn't run right now, mean that we block our natural responses. And so this can be part of how we end up traumatized, because we have this capacity for free will, we have the capacity or the reality that we're social creatures and that we follow social norms, all lead to the possibility that we can block some of our more instinctual needs. And there's something in this work that's really beautiful about returning to the simplicity of those needs. It's really about coming into the body, trusting what's going on in the body, trusting what needs to happen in the body. So earlier I began a division of two different types of trauma, and I framed the first type of trauma, which was shock trauma, these events that happen at high speed. And then the other one is developmental trauma. Now, developmental trauma is a way more complex beast to deal with, because with shock trauma, which is what we refer to when we refer to PTSD, normally the development of the individual has occurred and then an event has happened to them. And so they have a reference point of what normal was like before this event. And so they also have a reference of, well, what would it be like to get back to normal as well? So they have a sense of what I need to go through, what I need to. It's an easier process to go through and a shorter process. With developmental trauma, the context is very different. We're normally looking at some kind of dysfunctional system, dysfunctional parenting, dysfunctional home, that leads to the child not feeling safe in one way or another. Now, that might be literally physically safe, it might be not safe to express themselves, not safe to not know, not safe to be curious. Could be one of any sorts of things where the child doesn't have the freedom to really explore themselves, and the caretakers around them being attentive to their needs, but rather there tends to be a lack of care, a lack of space, a lack of autonomy given to that child. And within that context, the child starts to learn that it's not safe to explore, it's not safe to be themselves, and they start to adapt themselves to the situation. And so in that adapting to the situation, they start to use different survival techniques to keep themselves safe, one way or another, which could include people pleasing. It can include looking after the mother's needs. It can include cutting off from their own emotional needs, because their own emotional needs lead to the further dysregulation of the parents, as an example. And so what starts to happen is there starts to be a subtle mandating of the idea that there are certain emotions of mine that are not safe to be lived. There are certain ways of being that is not safe. There are certain expressions that are not safe. And so when those emotions naturally arise, because that's what emotions do, they naturally arise in given situations, and there is the feeling that I can't live this emotion, and so that emotion gets cut off and attempts to be repressed, and in its place, where the emotion gets repressed, pushed down, frozen, anxiety comes in its place. The anxiety of what will happen if I let myself feel this. And so these deep, because of the developmental periods themselves, because of these survival mechanisms coming online at a phase of developmental growth, they start getting included in the sense of self. So the child, rather than recognizing that, oh, I'm a good child in a very difficult situation, the child ends up assuming that because their needs aren't met, that they're wrong for having those needs. So the child starts actually assuming a sense of responsibility, a sense of shame, a sense of blame for being the way they are and for having the needs they have. And they start making themselves wrong for feeling the way they feel, needing what they need, wanting to express themselves the way they want to express themselves. And they start cutting off from all these essential parts of themselves. And in place of those essential parts, they start living out these survival mechanisms. So those survival mechanisms might be, instead of getting angry, get helpful. Could be, the list is very long of potential ways to get through this. But we start getting fight-flight responses. We start getting fawn responses. Now the fawn responses are the responses of doing everything possible to try and regulate the other person. So that looks like being obsequious, people-pleasing, helping excessively, in the hope that my actions will help keep the other person regulated. Now, in terms of parenting, parent-child relationships, the order of responsibility is inverted here. So rather than the parents looking after the child is emotionally caretaking or emotionally regulating the parents, right? Bert Hellinger, the founder of Family Constellations, talks about the order of love, the orders of love, and one of those natural orders of love is that parents care for children. And in these situations where we have dysregulated parents or dysregulated caregivers, the order gets inverted and the child starts taking on the adult role, looking after the parents. Now, this starts leading to anxiety, starts leading to freeze responses. So in that sense, it's the same as the PTSD responses. You have anxiety. In this case, the anxiety is produced in the attempt to not be feeling the emotions that are coming up, and freeze responses because there's a sense of hopelessness that starts to grow, the feeling of I'm not okay, and this is the big thing that happens here. Shame starts to come in. We start to get shaming, we start to get blaming, and and intimately tied into the sense of self. So starts creating ideas like I'm a bad person, I'm wrong, I'm not okay, there's something essentially wrong with me. So we start to get these types of thoughts coming online and start getting intimately entwined with the sense of self, the sense of I am. It's tied up with that negative connotation, with that anger pointed towards themselves. So in this kind of trauma, this is what's known now as complex PTSD. We have PTSD symptoms, but they come from a much more complex situation tied into the sense of self. So this is a relatively new category. I believe it's not even in the new DSM yet. But we're understanding more and more that so many of the responses from our nervous systems have to do with these kinds of responses. Events that we've been through in critical phases of developmental growth that have led to survival mechanisms getting coupled into our sense of self. And this requires a lot of work. It requires regulation, it requires the tools of self-regulation, but it also starts to require talking. It requires the understanding of how this complex pattern of survival came to be, and what were the emotions, the primary emotions that were being held underneath this pattern of survival responses. With PTSD, you can really work from it from a body up position. With complex PTSD, you need to go both directions. So you need somatic work, body up approach, but you also need psychotherapeutic work, top down. You need to be able to change those narratives about who you are, to get to the situation that I am a good person who survived a difficult, dysregulated situation and who is worthy of goodness, who is worthy of a good life. And so this is a great thing to aim at. How do we get to the place where we really say to ourselves, I deserve a good life? And if we can get to that understanding and that inner place, then the question is, well, what is the life you want to have for yourself? And within that, there's a whole extra question, which is, well, what do you want for yourself? And often when we're in these complex PTSD style responses, our ability to choose is hampered, let's say, because often rather than there's a natural response that we should have, let's say, and it's something like, let's move towards good things, let's move towards pleasure, and let's move away from pain. Let's move away from things that are harmful for us. Now that sounds super easy, like, oh, that burns, don't touch that again. So we move away from things that are bad for us and move towards things that are good for us. We could go into what's good for us, whether that's just pleasure good or responsibility good. That's a whole different question, or meaning good. But we move towards things that are good for us, move away from things that are bad for us. These are natural responses. Often in complex PTSD, this has been reversed. And so, I'll give you an example. Just imagine a young girl who grows up with a violent alcoholic father who, when he's not drinking alcohol, is very enthusiastic and loving. And so the girl grows up on the one hand feeling a real bond with the affectionate father that she has, but at the same time feeling fearful that he's going to be in an alcoholic rage, for example. And so the fear and the attachment start to get coupled in together. right? And so the girl grows up, and her relationship to men is that she starts looking for a man who is both very passionate and expressive, but who's also dangerous, just as an example. And so she starts going towards the person who feels dangerous, rather than noticing, oh, this feels scary, I'm going to move away from this person. And so there's something about the ability to really recognize what's good for me and what's not good for me, and can I move towards what's good for me, or do I move in the wrong direction? And so there can be a reprogramming from the ground up with somatic work, with somatic experiencing. And this is part of a boundary exercise where you practice noticing when it's uncomfortable and saying no. Really help building up the possibility that somebody can be assertive, like assertiveness training, and where they can state, no, this is uncomfortable for me, I'm leaving. No, I don't want this anymore, please leave. So these are all really important steps in terms of being able to set a boundary, say no to the thing I don't want, and start to move towards what I do want. So how do I make requests? How do I move towards the thing I do want? So with complex PTSD, these are all aspects. How do we step out of the inner critic that has taken on this self-shaming role? How do we put the boundaries in place to keep ourselves protected from harm? How do we make requests and really help ourselves start to create a vision of what we want and start to move towards it? So these are all important issues related to trauma and related to complex PTSD, complex trauma. Well, that feels like it's an interesting dive. I hope that's been useful to listen to. Please give me a like on this video if you found this interesting. Please share it with people that you think might find it interesting or useful as well. And don't forget to subscribe, and I'll be pulling out more videos too. I'm doing videos in English and in Spanish. It's quite a peculiar thing. I'm from the UK, and yet I spent a long time living in Argentina, and so I have as many people in Spanish as I do in English, probably more in Spanish in fact. So I'm doing these videos and I'm more comfortable in English, but I'm trying to do them in Spanish as well, so that I can really respond to the people both in Argentina and in Spain and well, wherever else they are. So yeah, thank you for tuning in, and thank you for staying to the end if you've got this far. I appreciate that, and hope to see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.